was about 5 weeks ago, May the 9th precisely, May the 9th, 2010, that marked the 50th anniversary of the introduction of the oral contraceptive pill in the United States. The pill arrived in Canada 1 year later, though it was only permitted as a therapy for menstrual disorders, and it wasn't until 1969 that the sale became legal as a contraceptive. The pill was hailed as a harbinger of the sexual revolution, the answer to unwanted children, the answer to a burgeoning global population, and the launching pad for women in the workplace. It was equally denounced by the religious primarily for fear it would destroy morality and promote promiscuity, and it was criticized in the media after women started taking ill and dropping dead from some of the early side effects. So my question for our next speaker, Dr. Andrea Tone, is: did the arrival of this tiny hormone-packed pill mark the beginnings of the rise of the female? This is Dr. Andrea Tone.
Let me begin by expressing my heartfelt gratitude to Moses Snizer and the entire Idea City team, including Ashley and my liaison assistant, Gail, who's waiting there in the wings, for truly the incredible privilege of being here and being part of an assemblage of absolutely extraordinary, intellectually inspiring women. I really am thankful and grateful. Being here on this stage, being able to talk about the history of contraceptives with you has special meaning for me. In late March of this year, as I was doing my daily dash from my office at McGill University to the place where I have to pick my daughter up before 6, otherwise they will call the police, etc., I received quite unexpectedly a phone call from a publicist in New Jersey. The publicist told me that she represented a very well-known pharmaceutical company, which I'm not going to name by name because I'm a little nervous I might get sued if I do. But said company had just bought the rights to manufacture one of the so-called newer designer oral contraceptives. And they wanted to know if I, as a historian of contraception and as a scholar of women's health, would be interested in participating in what they characterized as a media outreach program. Now, on the surface, it seemed like it was a pretty good thing. The publicist would organize a 2-day radio and television satellite tour in New York City. My expenses would be covered. My time participating in this tour would be extremely well compensated. Words I'll say again. Extremely well compensated. The debate, as it was subsequently framed, was yacht versus academic integrity. For me, as a scholar who really believes that public history is important, that those of us who are in the knowledge business have an obligation, when we can, to share our knowledge with different constituencies and different communities. As a scholar of women's health who believes fervently that we need to be talking about birth control and STIs a lot more, not less. And I would just sort of say, as a slight diversion from that point, but in keeping with the spirit of that point, 50 years ago, sex was something that was extraordinarily taboo culturally. It was so taboo that perhaps some of you in the audience may remember that television shows, family shows that aired in that coveted late afternoon, early evening time were not allowed to depict the master bedroom of a house as anything other than a sterile space that had two twin beds in it. I will say, as an aside, that this messed me up a little bit growing up, because my parents' master bedroom had, one very large bed, and I kind of wondered in the years before I worked up the courage to just ask them outright what this meant, that my parents, were freakishly sexually aberrant. Since that time, we've obviously come a long way in our willingness to talk about sex. We talk about sex in closets, sex in the classroom, sex in airplanes, sex with vampires, and of course we talk about sex in the city. And if there's just sort of one dream, one idea I would like all of us to walk home with, and just to think about, is what might happen if for every 10 or even 20 times sex is mentioned on the big screen, Hollywood, television, that we mention birth control and STIs as well. 1 for 20. I would actually honestly be happy 1 for 50. I think this might be the beginning of a really valuable public health contribution that would make contraception and not Mr. Big a household word. I should also add that I am not, as a scholar of women's health, someone who believes that all pharmaceutical companies and the drugs they manufacture are intrinsically evil. I think that you would be very hard-pressed to find a parent who came of age in the late 1940s or early 1950s who viewed antibiotics, in this case penicillin, as nothing short of a medical miracle. Bronchodilators are what keep my daughter and thousands of other asthmatics like her alive. And I want to believe, although this may reflect still my naivete, that the most conservative, right-wing politician in the United States has to believe that at the end of the day, women are better off with emergency contraception, the morning after pill, than coat hangers. As I weighed the pros and cons of this invitation to be part of a pharma-funded media outreach tour to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the pill, I ended up saying no. My daughter wondered then what would happen with the yacht, and I said, well, yachts aren't very practical in Montreal anyway. And I said no because I believe that public history needs to stay as public as it can, and that what was being offered was a kind of commercial hijacking of a really important moment in medical history that deserves to be discussed in a public forum such as this one. So I said no, and then I felt good about saying no for a little while. I felt virtuous, and I thought my rejoinder to my daughter's question was great, and we would have sort of peace in the household and no more longing for yachts. And then I happened to see, accidentally, the very long list of people who had already agreed to participate in this company-backed outreach plan. This list included eminent scientists who had been part of the making of oral contraceptives back in the late 1940s and early 1950s. It included not-for-profit activists who I know and respect. It included historians who I also know and respect. And I wondered, looking at this list and feeling rather crestfallen, whether the age of public history had ended. I contacted a publicist at McGill who I've worked with in the past, and she and I got very lucky. She sent off a pitch letter letting people know that I was available to talk about the history of the pill and that I wasn't taking money from a pharmaceutical company. And I suspect that the dozens of interviews I did is probably the reason I'm here today. Someone here saw one of these interviews, and I am therefore so profoundly thankful to be part of a public history that I think needs to go on. Had I gone to New York and talked about the history of the birth control pill, I suspect the narrative I would have been asked to give was a celebratory one. The publicist, of course, had mentioned that in return for the yacht and the other goodies and the travel to New York City, I would need to mention their products by name and to talk about how these new designer birth control pills really represented something novel and something innovative. And this pill history was a history that sought to communicate to people such as yourselves that the pill changed everything, that with the pill, we've inaugurated sort of the modern era of birth control, as if to say that birth control prior to the 1960 FDA approval date was somehow bad. So I've included up there some examples of contraceptives of the past. I realize that some of these don't look very aesthetically pleasing, and you may well wonder what a lemon is doing up there. And I would love to tell you more about each of these different devices, but I won't have time to. What I want to use this slide to illustrate is simply the diversity of contraceptives that existed prior to the pill. Many of them were probably not very safe. Some were not terribly effective. We put a lemon in that group. But they're there, and they're there as a tribute to the long-standing desire of men and women to separate sex from procreation. Is the pill revolutionary? The question that sort of Moses began with. Well, the answer is yes and no. And what's important to remember when we talk about the history of the pill is that it really was the first time when birth control became both feminized and medicalized. The first time in Western history when truly millions of women flocked to their doctor's offices to get a prescription for a drug that they did not need to prevent or treat a disease. This was really a breakthrough in pharmaceutical and medical history, and some might pinpoint this event and say this is what launched the era of lifestyle drugs that so many of us are debating the wisdom of now. I would say it was revolutionary in that it both empowered women by giving them the tools to prevent pregnancy or to plan their pregnancies better. And it was a tool that was almost 100% effective. And that distanced the pill from so many of its predecessors. We like to hear and believe that the pill was this marvelous feminist triumph. Margaret Sanger had been dreaming of a magic pill, such as the one that was delivered in 1960, since 1912, in fact. She died in 1966, 6 years before she saw her dream come to fruition. One of the sort of interesting twists in this narrative is that although the pill was envisioned by Sanger, it was actually brought to life by three remarkable and brilliant men, including Gregory Pincus, who got fan letters from women all over the world, grateful for the science he had conjured up in his lab. It included Carl Gerasi. It also included John Rock, who, as far as ironies go, he's a wonderful personage of that. He was a very dedicated Catholic who both ran the first clinical trials of the pill and attended Mass every single day. If we want to assess the pill now, I would suggest that we need to give it a kind of mixed grade in the pill's report card. And the reason is that the pill was, right from the get-go, incredibly profitable. And what it encouraged companies to do was to dedicate their research and development to new and improved variants of a product, which is what the pill is, as well as being a drug, a product that was phenomenally successful. Today in the United States, the pill market is $3.5 billion. This is huge, and what companies are doing now, and what they've been doing right from the 1960s, is jockeying for a larger part of that eminently profitable pie. Therefore, one consequence when we look at the choices women have today is that there are a lot more choices. There aren't just, the one pill we had in 1960. We have 40 different brands of pills today. And on top of those pills, we have patches, we have implants, we have shots, we have a vaginal ring that releases hormones. More choices yet, but choices that all reside within this very hormonal box. Interestingly, our new medical conundrum is this. 50 years ago, doctors had to almost reinvent their medical education because very few had training in endocrinology, and you needed to sort of bring yourself up to speed to prescribe hormones responsibly. Today, it's the flip problem. Women are very hard-pressed in Canada and in the United States to find a doctor who even knows how to fit a cervical cap or a diaphragm. In that sense, the pill revolution was revolutionary indeed. At the end of the day, I think it's important to remember that most women around the globe aren't lucky enough to be having these debates, or lucky enough to be able to afford a prescription or afford to be able to get access to a doctor. The pill may be popular, but the tragedy is that so many young women in particular are using it without condoms. What's happened is that 1 in 2 young women, sexually active, under the age of 25, now have an STI, typically chlamydia. Chlamydia, HIV/AIDS, again, not things that are household words as they should be. And what I would most like to see is a media outreach campaign that focused on education, more choices, the reality of infections and disease. And I think to do that would be to create a campaign whose revolutionary potential is something we might all want to work for. Thank you very much.